Hello, everyone! Steven Spielberg, the director of this movie, grew up reading the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales. Those stories were pretty dark and scary, and they had a way of teaching kids some important life lessons. This is why Spielberg believes every fairy tale should be spooky, yet magical. In this story, a 10-year-old girl who can't sleep one night ends up stumbling upon something that sends shivers down her spine. We find ourselves in 1983, on a late night in London. Red double-decker buses drive through the deserted streets. The pubs are still lively, filling the silence with cheerful tunes. Over at a local orphanage, the matron is getting ready to lock up for the night when she notices a magazine slid under the door with the mail. Curious, she takes a look and leaves. Unbeknownst to her, 10-year-old Sophie has been hiding under a blanket on the stairs and saw the whole thing. Sophie sighs, wraps the blanket around herself, and locks the orphanage herself. She then heads over to the clock with a swinging pendulum and nudges the hand forward by 15 minutes. Now the clock shows 3 o'clock in the morning, the witching hour that comes every night.
When the boogeyman comes out. When people go missing.
Sophie picks up the mail and turns off the light. She is the only one who never sleeps at this time. She is accompanied only by a ginger cat. Sophie diligently arranges the mail on the matron's desk, when suddenly she hears loud cries outside the window. She looks out into the street, where she notices 4 drunkards. Not the least bit frightened, Sophie demands that they stop disturbing the children's sleep. She threatens to call the police, and the men leave the alley in fear. The girl turns off the street lamp and leaves, without noticing the strange shadow outside the window. Sophie looks with admiration at the miniature house with a large, beautiful bed, and then heads to the shared bedroom. Back in bed, she puts on her glasses and switches on her flashlight to keep reading her book. Sophie skillfully hides from the matron, who checks if the children are asleep, and later, she and the cat hear the noise outside again. Sophie tiptoes to the window, quietly repeating the orphanage rules. Never get out of bed, never go to the window, and never look behind the curtains. Ignoring all 3 rules, she steps out onto the balcony and spots a bunch of cats rummaging through the trash. But in the next instant, a giant hand appears from around the corner and picks up an overturned trash can. A giant in a dark cape comes out into the street and is very surprised to see the orphan. Sophie, too, stands there stunned by what she sees. Suddenly, the giant takes a quick step and heads straight for the balcony. Realizing that she has made a terrible mistake, Sophie runs to the bed, where she tries to hide under the blanket. But a huge hand easily picks her up and gently pulls her out of the orphanage, wrapping her in a blanket. The massive giant dashes through the streets of London, evading the gaze of passersby with clever tricks. His cape effortlessly transforms into a curtain, concealing entire streets. Armed with his gigantic, trumpet-like tool, he blocks the light from street lamps. The giant pretends to be a tree, then jumps over the highway, making his way out of town. With powerful leaps, he crosses vast fields and rivers, carrying the girl high up into the mountains. His rocky hideout is veiled behind thick clouds. Inside the cave, he locks the stone door tightly and starts pacing, breathing heavily. On his desk, there's a massive cleaver and a foam box, with a huge cauldron hanging over the fireplace. The giant lights a lamp and hangs a blanket with Sophie on a tree branch. Then, he starts menacingly sharpening his blade. Meanwhile, the girl slips out of the blanket and carefully makes her way on the branches to the window. She pushes it with all her might, and luckily, the window gives in. However, Sophie accidentally drops some stuff from the windowsill, making noise that catches the giant's attention. He has enormous ears, picking up even the faintest sounds. He approaches the orphan with a frying pan in hand and points out that she won't be able to escape unless she has wings.
Or's hungry, his Dorver eats.
Sophie finds herself right in the frying pan. The giant returns to the table and continues to chop vegetables. With each mighty chop, the knife sends Sophie soaring. Sophie wonders where she ended up. She gets a surprising answer. She's in giant country. Sophie can't believe it, but looking out the window, she sees other enormous giants making a ruckus. The kidnapper starts listing the names of his fellow giants.
Flesh lump eater, bone cruncher, man hugger, child chewer.
Sophie gets really nervous when she hears the names Blood Bottler and Maid Masher. She pleads with the giant not to devour her, but the giant just laughs in response. He reassures her that not all giants eat humans, and he's one of those who don't. His way of speaking sounds a bit odd, and he stumbles over most of his words. Sophie is baffled about why she got kidnapped, but the giant brushes it off, claiming it's not really kidnapping since she's so tiny, though he adds that her parents must be worried about their daughter, to which Sophie replies that they are dead. Sophie doesn't like her life at the orphanage because the matron unjustly punishes the girls. Whenever she gets up to some mischief, the matron throws her into a creepy cellar filled with rats. The giant feels sorry for the orphan and calls the matron filthy old fizzwiggler. The girl asks about the other giants. Turns out that they indeed eat people, and Sophie should avoid them at all costs. The kind giant who kidnapped her is a runt compared to them and cannot protect Sophie. He scoops himself some chowder from the cauldron, explaining why he kidnapped Sophie. It's simple. He wants to keep the existence of giants secret from humans, and the girl would start talking about them left and right. The old man has seen what human beings do to the animals they keep in cages. He doesn't want to end up like them. So now, the orphan will have to live in his cave. Sophie promises to keep the secret and begs him to take her back, but the giant flatly refuses. They will be together for the rest of their lives. After reluctantly finishing his meal of snozcumbers, the giant covers Sophie with a blanket. The girl keeps screaming that she won't accept this fate and plans to run away regardless. The kidnapper thinks it's ridiculous because she'll get eaten right away. He takes the defiant girl to the top of the highest mast of the ship that he uses as his bed. Sophie, feeling desperate and angry, starts correcting the giant's countless mispronunciations, unintentionally hurting the old giant's feelings.
I cannot be helping it if I'm saying things a little squiggly.
He says he can't do anything about the way he speaks, and the girl apologizes. The giant then pulls a glowing vial out of his bag. Turns out there's a real dream inside it. Sophie says she doesn't have dreams because of her insomnia, and then the giant starts reading her a book that fell out of the girl's blanket. Just a few sentences in, Sophie is already dozing off. The old giant immediately grabs his bag and runs to another part of the cave. Pulling a lever, he reveals a secret lab behind a waterfall. Inside, there are many dream jars, and the giant begins mixing red fizzing ingredients that look explosive. Hours later, Sophie is awakened by a thunderous snore coming from the deck. She unhooks one of the ropes, and the mast tilts toward the window, pushing it open. The girl gets out and runs along the rocks, but is soon caught by an unfamiliar giant. She calls for help, but the kind giant, sighing heavily, only closes the door of his dwelling. Screaming, Sophie flies into the mouth of the huge monster and immediately wakes up from the nightmare. She immediately realizes that this is the work of her kidnapper, who was trying to teach her a lesson. The giant doesn't deny it and sits down to have breakfast. Sophie sees an unusual soda bottle, where the bubbles defy gravity and actually go downward instead of up. It turns out to be frobskottel, the delightful drink of giants. Curious about how the gases manage to escape, Sophie watches as the old man takes a massive sip.
Glummy!
They are interrupted by a surprise visit from the chief giant, Flesh Lump Eater, who is 3 times taller and more muscular than the kind giant. Flesh Lump Eater is angry. He calls the kind giant a runt and complains that he's being noisy so early. He wants the kind giant to heal his boo-boo, which is his injured finger. Sophie is terrified and hides behind objects on the table, while the kind giant tries to fix the problem quickly. Flesh Lump Eater is afraid of water and hates the vegetables that the runt eats. Suddenly, he smells the delicious scent of a human and suspects that the kind giant is hiding someone again. Flesh Lump Eater starts searching for Sophie, and the girl cleverly hides inside the yucky snozcumber. The friendly giant, completely unaware of this, offers his guest a veggie to satisfy his hunger. When he spots Sophie's leg sticking out, he stops the meal and reminds Flesh Lumper that giants don't eat such gross things. It works like a charm, and Flesh Lump Eater settles for frobskottel instead, saying as he leaves that the strange, good-for-nothing runt is a disgrace to their whole giant clan. Sophie gets out of the snozcumber all covered in slime. The friendly giant takes her to his lab, where he douses her with clean water and helps her dry off. He even has a stash of human clothes, so Sophie changes into some dry ones. The giant puts a blanket, glasses, and a book in a tree hollow for the orphan to sleep away from the other giants. When he turns to look at Sophie, he sees her wearing a dress and a red jacket that happens to fit her perfectly. The old giant looks a bit sad for a moment, but quickly regains his composure. He has to get to work, and Sophie must stay in the tree hollow. The curious girl asks him about his job, and it turns out that the giant is a dreamcatcher. The orphan wants to join him, but as usual, gets turned down. It's too dangerous to go out. After glancing at the vials of dreams around her, Sophie flips her jacket inside out and tries to reason with the giant again. Sooner or later, they'll have to tell each other all their secrets anyway. Sophie takes the first step and confesses that she also sneaks around at night, sometimes stealing candies and telling lies.
So I'm lonely most of the time. I have never had a best friend. Sounds like you, Albert.
The girl convinces him that Flesh Lump Eater will smell her here too, and the anxious giant gives up. He puts Sophie on his shoulder, and they leave the cave. The rest of the giants are sleeping on the ground, and now they must quietly sneak past them. But the plan goes awry, and the kind giant gets caught by his leg. Flesh Lump Eater and the other giants start wondering where their brother is headed at this hour. Sophie quickly tosses aside her blanket and hides in a nearby car. The brutal giants playfully toss the runt to each other like a ball. Then, one giant grabs 2 cars, one of which Sophie is hiding in, and climbs up the hill. There, he steps on the car roofs, turning them into makeshift roller skates, and speeds up. On the opposite hill, another giant is already waiting, ready to put the kind giant on a truck and push him down. A collision seems inevitable, but miraculously, Sophie remains unharmed as she turns the steering wheel and guides the giant's foot aside. As a result, the giant on skates gets headbutted into his most vulnerable body part. Both participants of this stunt, that looks like something straight from the TV show Jackass, go flying, and the other giants burst into laughter. They want to keep the fun going, but a thunderstorm comes to the rescue. The silly giants are terrified as rain pours down on their heads. In their panic, they completely forget about the kind giant and rush for cover, banging their heads as they run. The old man retrieves Sophie's glasses and places the girl in a bag. Meanwhile, Flesh Lump Eater notices the blanket stuck to his foot, and he and his brother smell the human again. They realize that the kind giant was definitely hiding a human, and they intend to find her by all means. But the kind giant has already carried Sophie away from the man-eaters. Rising above the clouds again, he shows the girl Dream Country. It's always night there, and the sky is full of stars, with a sprawling tree in the middle. The giant claims he can listen to the stars, animals, and trees chatting with each other, from the biggest creatures to the tiniest critters and even leaves.
I was hearing all the wondrous and all the terrible things.
The old giant puts Sophie on the ground, and she walks up to the lake. When she looks at the reflection of the branches, she sees thousands of dream lights, which you can't spot by simply glancing at the tree. The giant tells Sophie that he was once called Big Friendly Giant and asks the girl's name. Sophie introduces herself and then dives into the lake following the giant. Once she hits the water surface, she immediately flips over and lands on solid ground. This is the world where the dreams live. The leaves of the magic trees emit colorful lights from their veins. The giant has a special fondness for one particular flicker that appears very rarely. The dreamcatcher chases after the nimble Fizzwizard, but can't manage to catch it in his scoop net. The Fizzwizard playfully taunts the giant, then makes its way towards Sophie. The elderly giant catches it, revealing that the Fizzwizard recognizes the girl and sounds like her. They capture the dream in a jar, and it draws the shape of Sophie's face. The giant encourages the girl to catch other lights as well, then signs the jar as Sophie's Dream. The orphan girl has fun running around and playing with the dreams, eventually catching a bright red sizzling spark. The giant quickly picks up a wicked Trogglehumper and locks it away. He hears a menacing whisper.
Look at what you has done, and there be no forgiveness.
All of a sudden, the giant vanishes into the mist. Sophie, scared, calls out to him and chases after him. However, the giant calmly pulls the girl out of the lake since he had already gotten out before her. Sophie decides that she will call him BFG, short for Big Friendly Giant. They travel together to London to share good dreams with sleeping children. The giant affectionately calls them Chiddlers. It turns out that the giants don't have parents and are as ancient as the earth itself. BFG can listen to the beating hearts and sense the emotion of all children, including Sophie back when she lived in the orphanage. The dreamcatcher sends out beautiful blue lights from his trumpet, and the boy starts dreaming about the president giving him a call. With a big grin on his face, he feels important and all grown up. With their work complete, the heroes venture towards the city's outskirts, when all of a sudden, the old giant hears the sound of crying and senses pain in children's hearts. From afar, they spot the other giants returning home from their trip to the human world. Sophie gets furious, and then it hits her that her blanket is missing. BFG quickly figures out that they left it in the land of giants, and he becomes worried. Suddenly, Sophie wakes up. She is lying in front of the entrance to the orphanage and believes she is dreaming, but that's not quite so. She is actually in London. The girl calls out to the giant, and BFG reluctantly replies from the darkness that he had to bring Sophie back because the other giants will now look for her in giant country. The orphan protests, and then BFG tells her about the boy he picked up at an orphanage before her. The boy was lonely too, and he also noticed the giant. He taught the old man to read, and it was his jacket that Sophie found. But the boy was caught by other giants and suffered a sad fate.
I could have brought him back home, but then it'd be too late.
The girl rushes to catch up with her friend who's leaving, shouting that she's not scared and wants to stand up to the other giants. But BFG still leaves. When she returns to the orphanage, the girl recalls that the old giant can hear every heart. Sophie gathers her courage and goes out onto the balcony again, this time climbing onto the railing. Believing her friend will catch her, she jumps down and lands in his big, soft palm. BFG once again takes his stubborn friend back to his cave, but Flesh Lump Eater is hiding under a hill and sees them. In the dream lab, the friends try to come up with a plan, and then other giants break into BFG's house. Flesh Lump Eater shows the blanket he has found, and the gang proceeds to turn the house upside down. Dreams fly out of broken vials, and Sophie tries to take refuge in the tree hollow. She tries desperately to sneak away from the giants and dives into a chute of water. From there, the girl sneaks closer to BFG, and he once again wants to hide his friend in his bag. But Flesh Lump Eater notices this and takes the bag away. Sophie runs and stumbles into the previous guest's room, which the old man has set up in another tree hollow. Inside, there are a lot of toys, children's furniture, and cute drawings. One of them is signed as The Big Friendly Giant and Me. The girl is captivated as she gazes at it, but Flesh Lump Eater is already getting close. BFG couldn't bear to watch silently any longer, so he grabs a red-hot fire poker, wraps it in Sophie's blanket, and uses it to scare off the intruders. They get burned and have to make a hasty retreat from his house. Then, BFG douses Flesh Lump Eater with water.
You is the insult to giants.
While exploring the boy's room, Sophie stumbles upon a dusty portrait of the Queen of England. She cleans it off and comes up with a clever plan. Sophie leaves a folded jacket on the bed and returns to the trashed lab. BFG, feeling frustrated about the broken jars with lights, berates himself for the silly way he speaks. Sophie puts his mind at ease, telling him that his speech is far from bad. It's actually magnificent, which brings great joy to BFG. He starts coming up with more and more mangled words to express his joy, but the girl cuts him off. They urgently need to reach the palace and give the queen the most terrible nightmare about giants who eat people. Their goal is to convince Her Majesty to take action against the man-eaters. Sophie convinces the giant to blend all the dream ingredients they have, making sure to add both BFG's and her own images to the nightmare. This way, they'll appear in the queen's dream, and when she wakes up, they'll be right outside her window. The giant feels a bit unsure about revealing himself, but the persistent girl talks him into doing it. They arrive at Buckingham Palace, where they easily get past the guards unnoticed. BFG follows the sound of the queen's heart and sends her a nightmare. The woman starts mumbling in her sleep, and when morning comes, she leaps out of bed in fear. She tells her entourage about the cannibals. Mary, her maid, thinks it's a weird coincidence. The news headlines mention the orphans disappearing without a trace. They still don't believe giants are responsible for that, but as they open the window, they find Sophie sitting on the windowsill. The queen recalls seeing the girl in a dream and asks if a giant lifted her upstairs. Sophie says that her friend is waiting in the garden and calls out to him, but BFG doesn't show himself. Sophie realizes that the giant is afraid, but the queen no longer believes her. Then BFG does reveal himself, and he is immediately surrounded by armed soldiers. The queen orders the guards to stand down, and BFG swears allegiance to Her Majesty. Of course, out of excitement, he mangles his words.
Your Majesty, I is your humbug servant.
Struggling with words, he still manages to convey his desire to help with the issue of the disappearing children. The queen agrees, but mentions she needs to change out of her nightgown first. She calls Moscow and Washington to share crucial information with the world leaders before gathering a council of ministers. The pet corgis, Sophie, and BFG go to the hall for the ceremonial breakfast. Naturally, the giant is very clumsy, knocking down a big antique chandelier from the ceiling. Luckily, the rest of the room fits in perfectly with a specially designed huge table. The servants work hard to follow all the rules of etiquette, serving 10 times more food than usual. BFG loves the delicious food and decides to never eat slimy snozcumbers again. Sophie too indulges in desserts she could only dream of having back at the orphanage. The giant enjoys everything except for coffee, which he spits out at the butlers, drenching them from head to toe. Without thinking twice, the giant takes out a bottle of frobscottle and wants to offer a glass to Her Majesty. The awkward situation is saved by the arrival of the generals. The Queen orders to urgently prepare an attack on the land of giants to stop kidnappings. BFG points out the way to giant country on the map and then shares frobscottle with everyone there, including the corgis. After raising a toast to the giants' well-being to the sound of bagpipes, they all enjoy some galumptious whiz-bopping music. Afterwards, BFG leads the soldiers into the land of giants. The helicopters fly into thick clouds, and the flight instruments begin to fail. However, they manage to safely cross the border of the Magic Kingdom. The army waits in ambush, while BFG and Sophie hurry to the lab to whip up a nightmare for those wicked giants. The Trogglehumper caught by Sophie is going to come in handy, as it makes people suffer from pangs of conscience. Outside, BFG tells Sophie about the Fizz Wizard, a girl's cherished dream. In this dream, she grows up and has a loving family of her own.
There'll be great successfuls, funnies ahead for her, and
she'll have some dribbles of despair, of course. Sophie sees all of this in her dream, and when she wakes up, she's no longer in giant country. The girl is feeling sad about her separation from her friend, but BFG tells her not to worry. He assures her that he'll always be able to hear her with his big ears. With the first rays of the sun, it's time to let the nightmare loose on the giants. But suddenly, BFG realizes that he left his trumpet in the palace. Sophie grabs the jar and runs towards the evil giants. She tries to release the lights, but she is noticed by the awakened flesh lump eater. Then the girl smashes the jar to pieces. The sparks fly into the giants' heads, and only their leader catches the nightmare and flattens it. The others scream and roll around on the ground, consumed with guilt. Enraged, Flesh Lump Eater goes for Sophie. BFG jumps in to protect her. Sophie makes a run for it, while BFG does his best to convince his brother to stop eating people. His persuasive efforts fall short, and Flesh Lump Eater takes a swing at BFG. Just in the nick of time, a lasso from a helicopter comes flying and stops Flesh Lump Eater's hand. The soldiers spring into action, restraining the giants, and Sophie deftly avoids the tumbling bodies. BFG catches his friend again just in time, and together, they watch as the evil giants are carried toward the horizon. They find themselves stranded on a remote desert island, where they are thrown into the sea just off the coast. To keep them from starving, they're bombarded with snozcumbers and given a whole box of seeds of this nasty vegetable. Sophie is back in London, and she's now living in the Buckingham Palace as a reward for her bravery. When she wakes up in the morning, she recalls a lovely dream about the land of giants, where BFG happily tends to a gigantic vegetable garden. He keeps planting snozcumbers, as they are the essential ingredient for the delightful frobscottle. Besides that, BFG spends his time writing a book. As Sophie gazes out the window, she knows that if she ever feels lonely, she can simply whisper something, and her dear old friend will always hear her. BFG's face lights up with a smile whenever he hears her words.
Good morning, BFG.
The movie's script is based on Roald Dahl's children's book, The BFG, which he dedicated to his daughter, Olivia. Sadly, she passed away from an illness when she was only 7 years old in 1962, 20 years before the book got published. This happens to be Steven Spielberg's first movie for Disney Studios during his impressive 50-year-long career. The whole project took almost 25 years to come together. Spielberg teamed up with screenwriter Melissa Matheson for this project. They also worked together on another beloved children's movie, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Unfortunately, Melissa Matheson passed away before the movie's release, and Spielberg dedicated the film to her memory. As always, check the name of the movie in the video description. Meanwhile, tell us in the comments, what was the most amazing dream you've ever had? Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to see even more cool recaps.